Hello, everyone, and welcome to the participants who are gathering, I think, slowly. We are working just through some slight technical issues to bring everyone on screen, and then we will get started in one moment. So just some slight patience. Up, there's Professor Bradford. Great. And great. Are we ready to get started? Great. Thank you so much for joining us for this event today. It is really an honor to be asked to moderate this as part of the Science Po Digital Chair, Governance and Sovereignty School of Public Affairs. We are very lucky today to be joined by, appropriately digitally, Professor Anu Bradford of Columbia Law School, and the author of, let me hold up my copy as my well-thumbed copy of Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology, for a discussion about her book for the next hour and what it's going to kind of say about AI, all of the new industries that are kind of coming and going, about the future of online speech in the global marketplace. Professor Bradford is the Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia Law School, and she's also the author of The Brussels Effect, which is, I would highly recommend to you. It is very relevant to a European audience, but I think actually sometimes I think it is most relevant to an American audience, how the European Union rules the world. And this is her second book. I think it is your second book. And yeah, okay. And Digital Empires is basically a discussion. I will briefly kind of summarize it. A discussion in three parts of three different models of global emergence in digital ruling of the world from a perspective not of the tech companies, but from the states and the nation states that are kind of controlling these technologies. And I just want to kind of foreground the fact that, because we're going to talk about this so much, that there are the three models that are kind of brought up by Professor Bradford are essentially kind of a rights-based model based in the EU, a markets-based model based in the US, and a state power-driven model from China. And these are kind of taken into a comparative approach to kind of go through the different ways. Each of these are competing to control these technologies and how they're interacting for global control of kind of these digital empires. It's an idea that was foregrounded, I would say, like by your colleague, Professor Tim Wu, Anu, a number of years ago, and Professor Jack Goldsmith, this idea of who controls the internet, this idea that this is going to be this new bastion for both state sovereignty and state control, and for geopolitics nationally. But you really bring in with this piece both the legal aspects of how this is unfolded in the intervening years since the early 90s, when Professor Wu and Professor Goldsmith wrote their book, and the legal background of everything that's changed, but also the market background, like what has stayed the same, kind of shockingly, and what has progressed, not at all, or or what powers have kind of come up in the ether and what powers have not. We're going to also talk about kind of the nation states and the global actors that we're not talking about in this book, of course. And so I just kind of, with that, I will turn it over to Professor Bradford with this kind of prompt. I'm going to share my screen really quickly if I can. I have this little model that I kind of wanted to probe you on. So as I was reading the book, and as I've read the book and kind of had time to kind of unfold it, one of the things that strikes me is that the rights-based model, the market, or I've renamed it kind of industry-based model here, or the state control model, are these three models, and you bucket USA in the industry market model, EU in the rights model, and China in the state control model. But I wonder if there isn't kind of this Venn overlapping diagram of these models in a certain sense. Certainly the US has very little state control over any of its industries or any of its technology. It's hamstrung by the First Amendment, which I would say is really strongly in the rights model. The EU, in contrast, is able to exert regulatory and state control, but in a rights framework. And then China is really able to kind of exploit the hard technology and the markets and the development and the innovation in the industry the same to the in the only to compete with like the US, I think is its only main competitor in that realm. And so I'm just kind of curious, what you make of kind of the model as reframed in kind of this way, or why you would say this is not the way to think about it.
So thank you so much, Kate, and thank you all for hosting me. I am really excited to share this conversation with you. And I think your prompting question, Kate, is a really good place for us to start. So the goal of the book is to bring analytical clarity by identifying these distinct regulatory models. And I think it's really important to recognize that none of these models, however, are pure. There are elements that they borrow from each. And maybe I walk you through that one right now, because if I just sort of roughly describe the three models first, and then which I still think explains why I find it appropriate to label them market-driven, state-driven, and rights-driven, but then why I think we also need to take a step back and recognize that there are some overlaps and there are some elements which they borrow from one another. So the core of the market-driven model is really this American conviction that we want to maximize free speech, free internet, and incentives to innovate. So the state is reserved a more minimalist role, and the governance of technology is basically handed over to the tech companies. So it is a techno-libertarian, techno-optimist view of the world. The Chinese and the state-driven model is premised on this idea that China wants to make the country a technological superpower, but the government is also prepared to leverage state resources to reach that goal. But the Chinese government also deploys technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to entrench the power of the Communist Party and preserve social stability within the nation. And here the Europeans are often portrayed as being forced to choose between the Chinese digital world and American digital world because there is no strong European tech industry. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not willing to, nor are they forced to, choose between the China and the US. The Chinese model for the Europeans is too oppressive, but the American model, on the other hand, is too permissive. So for that reason, the Europeans have carved out their own third way to think about digital governance, and that is this human-centric digital transformation, where the preservation of fundamental rights of individuals, the democratic structures of the society, and a notion of a more fair distribution of the gains from digital transformation takes the center stage. So the Europeans are prepared to redistribute power away from large platforms to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. But then to Kate's question, are there any overlaps? And I think there actually are. So if you think about America is not the only country that believes that markets do help and markets are important in fostering digital development. So if you look at the Chinese tech giants, their success cannot only be traced to state subsidies from Beijing. There's actually a lot of venture capital that spurred this Chinese industry into existence, including American venture capital. So they have been tapping into global financial markets, global capital markets to fuel their growth. So in that sense, there's certainly a market-driven foundation to some extent there. I also would say that there are elements of rights-driven model in the Chinese model. Yes, they are comfortable with mass surveillance in the way that the Europeans are, and it does compromise the fundamental right to privacy. But the Chinese are not only there, it's very hard to think that the government could rule only by oppressing people. There's been a lot of commitment to advance the consumer welfare. So the Chinese government is prepared to reserve the right to surveil the citizens, but it is concerned of the company's commercial exploitation of the Chinese consumers. So there are rules around antitrust that Europeans call competition law, where it sort of prevents price discrimination by these companies or limits the way these companies use sometimes the users' data. So I think there is also an overlap there. And then if you think about the European model, it is ultimately the digital regulations also serve the goal to create a single market, to remove those obstacles from data transfer, for instance. And that is part of a neoliberal European project to create a common market, which I think serves free trade as much as it serves the establishments of greater rights. And then I think I would like to mention this. I think that how state-driven model is now increasingly dominating globally to some extent in the era of more national security-driven view of technology, where we are worried about geostrategic interests of the countries in the era of the heightening conflict and the tech war. So in many ways, I have warned that recently the US and the EU are both playing Beijing's game. They are both implicitly moving towards some features of the state-driven model. No, they are not engaging in censorship the way the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in censorship, but we see massive subsidies of tech industry in order to then enhance technological sovereignty in the EU. And this is France is at the very center of this conversation of strategic autonomy, technological sovereignty. If you listen to Commissioner Thierry Breton, it's not just rights that he talks about. He really talks about leveraging state funding to build then these capabilities in Europe. We see massive export controls, investment restrictions in order to limit China's access to technologies. And here is, I think, one concern that I have, that when the Europeans and Americans are playing Beijing's game, Europeans can also become major export of techno-protectionism. So if you believe in, Kate mentioned my earlier work on the Brussels effect, we should keep in mind that the Brussels effect is a tool to export good and bad regulations alike. And if Europeans now start converting their rights-driven regulation into a tool for industrial policy and protectionism, that's what the European companies may find in third markets as well. So in that sense, I think it's really interesting to think about this more dynamically, the way you are inviting me to think about, Kate, that there is still fundamentally, when it comes to these trade-offs, Chinese trust the state, Americans trust the market, the Europeans do prioritize citizens, but their convictions are not absolute.
Yeah, that was masterful. And thank you for kind of using that as a way to walk us through kind of your argument. And just, I think also what is something that we're going to get into, hopefully with the questions, just a really incredibly deeply researched book. And it is one thing to make a lot of these arguments in theory, but I think that the evidence that you marshal around these arguments is very convincing. I just wanted kind of to follow up on one thing, like in particular. You mentioned the idea of Chinese capital going into the American markets, you mentioned the American money going to the Chinese markets, and I wanted to ask you if the opposite is true, because I suspect that it is, which is, and I think you talk about this at some point, but is the one universal language to a certain extent in all of this investment and money that like flows between borders in terms of how is everyone chasing, no matter where it is or what country it's placed, the next big thing to kind of put their money behind?
So absolutely. So there's been a lot of US investors that have become very wealthy by investing in China. But also they have become very wealthy when they have been facilitating Chinese companies' IPOs in US stock exchanges, and then facilitating and playing part in funding Chinese companies' investments in the EU. But China has also benefited, not just growing these companies in China, but also then when it builds these infrastructures around the world. Huawei is trying to find global markets for its 5G infrastructures. Chinese hardware companies are selling phones, building e-commerce platforms across the world. They are really tapping into global consumers and global capital. And I think that's what is so interesting here, is that we are in this era of tech war, putting governments into this very difficult position that they realize that there are national security interests that push them towards decoupling. There are conversations that Chinese companies should not list in the United States. China does not want them to disclose all the data they need to disclose as part of the requirements of US stock exchanges. But at the same time, the Chinese government knows that these companies are going to be adversely affected if they need to decouple themselves from the global capital markets. The same way the US is now imposing various export licensing, so it's restricting the exportation of many US technologies to China. But it also continues to grant these licenses in many instances because it knows that the US companies need the profits they are generating in Chinese market. Apple is gaining 20% of its revenue from China, and cutting off that opportunity is very hard for Apple to replace. So we are in this between what I call rivalry and restraint. That means that the governments are aware of the trade-offs. They need the economic gains. They get the message from their tech companies, we need access to global markets. Don't prevent us from going to China the same way Chinese companies want to continue to go abroad. But then they're alternating with national security messages that call for then restricting that access. So I think we are kind of seeing periods of escalation alternate with de-escalation. And we are living in what I like the phrase, this Mark Leonard wrote the book, The Age of Unpeace. I think it is the kind of age of unpeace. It's not fully a peace. It's not fully truce, but it's not all out conflict either. It's a costly conflict, but it can be, at least for now, managed.
Yeah, and I think Leonard also talks about the trade-off of rights that like is implicit in what you're talking about. It's not just a national security trade-offs and market trade-offs that countries are making, but the private industries that are deciding to go into these are making concessions to these nation states in a rights framework, and so that's something to kind of think about as well, as in a new governance type of model. I'm just going to take this opportunity to introduce our amazing graduate students who thank you so much for working so hard to put this event together and for doing such a great job organizing it. Julia Gelenti is a master's student in European Affairs. She's specializing in digital and new technology at Sciences Po Paris. And I apologize for any terrible pronunciations, trying to do a perhaps French version of people's various Portuguese and Italian and French names is going to be the death of me as an American. But thank you so much, Julia, for putting this together. And I will turn the next question over to you.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much, Professor Bradford, for being here. Thank you, Professor Koenig, for moderating this conversation. And great thanks also to Gustavo and Laura that are going to join us now in the moderation of the discussion for putting this together. So I think we've started the conversation with a great introduction, but we were interested, Professor Bradford, in kind of taking a step back and asking you directly, how was it for you to conduct these studies, and specifically a little bit more about the methodology that you followed to go through this research across 3 different models, especially thinking that being yourself European and having studied and researched in the US, you might have had to face some sort of biases or some sort of preconceptions in trying to analyze specifically, but not solely the Chinese market and the Chinese model, but also the Indian one and other continents that you've studied.
So Julia, that's a really good question. And I must say that the process itself was what made this book so much fun to write. Even though I do all my own writing, I rely on an extensive team of research assistants. So I'm very fortunate that we have very international student base. So I was able to work with Chinese students who are native speakers, who know the laws, who were able to analyze the laws. And I had lengthy conversations with them to make sure that I also can sort of incorporate the material that would not be accessible for me otherwise. And so especially I think the China chapters were a challenge for me to write because I am a specialist in European law. It was much more accessible, much more intuitive that I tell the European story. But look, there's some kind of a commitment that I made is that as a scholar, I want to write books, not just what I know, but what I want to know. And I really thought this was the opportunity to delve much deeper into something that I wanted to ultimately master in a way that I have a much deeper understanding. But it required not only extremely talented Chinese students, but I also shared the drafts with various Chinese professors and China scholars who read drafts early on. So I'm not afraid of exposing like very faulty work early on that then gets improved through the feedback that I get. So it really required a lot of back and forth manuscript conference where I had scholars specialized in different domains to help me really weave the argument together. So, and I think also when it comes to the US, when I really tried to understand the national security imperatives, I had extensive conversations with my colleagues that work on foreign affairs and national security. When it came to issues like, Section 230, the US's commitment to free speech and how we think about content moderation. I actually started from Kate's article. It's one of the few articles I've read 3 times because it was so incredibly seminal work in this field. And then that provided me a basis to start having conversation with people who are much deeper in their knowledge of US Constitution. How do we think about platform governance? So it really was the way that you are kind of willing to take some intellectual risk and make the investment in reading a lot of people's work and discussing your work with them and sort of willing to really learn along the way. So I would say that I think was absolutely critical for the process.
And next, I wanted to introduce Gustavo Ribeiro. Gustavo is a master's student in public policy specializing in digital and new technologies, Sciences Po Paris as well. And he is a UNESCO consultant with the Digital Transformation Artificial Intelligence team within the sector for communication and information. Gustavo, thank you for your helping organize this conference and for your question.
Thank you for the introduction, Kate, and Anu Bradford. Thank you for being here as well. It is a pleasure as someone who's been following your work for some years now. It's very nice to be hosting and participating in this event. So as a background, I'm originally from Brazil, so my question resonates with that. You've presented as 3 models for digital governance competing worldwide, and I wanted to ask you and I wanted to make the distinction, like how can countries outside of those 3 models, particularly first middle powers like India, Brazil, and perhaps we can also include the United Kingdom there, but also in addition to that, how countries from the global south that perhaps are not so, don't possess the same peculiarities as India and Brazil, can navigate this global competition for a digital model.
Very good. Thank you, Gustavo. And I do have some like New York renovation background noise. So do tell me if you can't hear me. Now it seemed to have stopped, but I may try to get my my headphones if it's distracting. So I think it's a very important question because there's more to the world than 3 empires. And I think a lot of the interesting questions are around how the empires shape the rest of the world. And there are some markets where you talk about bigger players, exactly like India and Brazil, that are able to more strategically to shape the digital economy by selectively emulating the various empires. So there's still a lot of, in places like Brazil, a lot of US tech companies. You cannot provide all your native tech companies to provide those services. And there's a lot of still infrastructure that is also foreign. And I think Brazil is among the countries that has adopted many elements of the GDPR and followed very similar kind of tact in antitrust cases against companies like Google. So there are countries that are larger, that have more regulatory and technological capability to not fully be at the mercy of the empires, but still not being able to fully replicate what these empires are looking at or what they are offering. So they look at these empires and emulate aspects. But then there are countries in the global south that I think have no choice sometimes but to take, for instance, Chinese infrastructure. Because China is offering these 5G networks, undersea cables, data centers, smart cities, safe cities, to places like countries in Africa, which need the path to digital development, which need the Chinese infrastructure because it's affordable and it's pretty good, and often the only game in town. If the Americans and Europeans are not providing them that infrastructure, you cannot ask why they would be turning to the Chinese one. And for these countries too, I don't think issues like when Europeans and Americans warn them of surveillance by Beijing or that they lose their privacy, there are many countries who say, look, privacy is not my number 1 concern. That's a luxury concern for Europeans and for some Americans who care about it. But we need development. And we are taking the Chinese infrastructure because privacy is not in my top 20 concerns that I wake up in the mornings to think about. So I think that makes it sometimes a little bit harder for these countries to do anything but what they can afford and what is available for them. I think there's now a really interesting conversation about AI revolution, where the AI technologies are very much concentrated into the wealthiest economies. And the question is whether the AI will further accentuate the inequalities and leave the global south behind. Some say that the alternative can happen if we really rely on open source models that then could be used in many parts of the world, that could be a tool to democratize the access to AI. But at the same time, there are those who really warn against the security risks if we make these models very widely available, and that are less optimistic that this would be kind of a leveling the playing field and providing the way for the global south to catch up with the rest of the world. So we have institutions like the United Nations that is very much advocating for access to all in this technology and trying to push for the kind of governance frameworks where the global south has the voice and it's not just a passive recipient of what the developers of technology decide how AI is being governed. But I think it's a very rich question, Gustavo, and there's much more to be said about the global south, and there's not just a simple single answer. It depends kind of what their vulnerabilities are and what their options are and whether some of them are able to play these empires off against one another.
So that was excellent, and it also kind of dovetailed. You brought up AI, which is definitely something that we are going to pivot to now, in part with Laura's question. Laura Zurdo is also a master's student at Sciences Po, specializing in digital technology. Laura, go ahead.
Hello everyone. Professor Bradford, Professor thank you for being today here with us. Yeah, the comments on governance and on AI really do fit well with the following comments. With the following question. You've explained very well how the different empires can find common ground, and in AI, this technology, where there is such like geopolitical and economic competition, we're nevertheless seeing intense discussions in international fora, for example, at the UN or G7 with some international guiding principles. So we were curious to know, what is your view on this international governance in the sense of how impactful can multilateralism and broader international governance fora be at setting global standards and at materializing this common ground in a technology and in a policy area such as AI?
So thank you, Laura. I would have sort of two-part answer. One is what role I would like that international governance to play, and the second, what I believe it will actually play. So I think there's a very strong normative argument why AI ought to be governed at the global level. AI does not respect borders, and there are massive costs to innovation if we have a fragmented regulatory framework, and these developers need to basically navigate very conflicting demands across the world. There's also greater security risks if they have like well-governed frameworks for AI in some markets, but those are offset when we have many other markets where there are no governance mechanisms in place. So tremendously important that there would be global conversation. At the same time, I'm afraid we don't live in the era that is very conducive to meaningful, substantive, binding international collaboration. I commend the UK for hosting the AI summit. I think it was the right thing to invite China, but what do you expect of a declaration that is signed by the US and China and the EU? They continue to the dialogue. There's a commitment to that. They all pursue accountability, transparency, and governance frameworks to the extent appropriate and consistent with their different national frameworks. So I think that the biggest achievement of the UK-hosted AI summit was that it generated more momentum for governments within their own national jurisdictions to start pursuing regulation. But I think we didn't make too much progress in actually pursuing some kind of a global AI treaty. I'm particularly worried there about existential risk and weaponization of AI and the use it in warfare, where I think some kind of an arms control treaty would be particularly helpful. Thus far, we have unilateral declaration from the US that they will always use a human before they would ever resort to nuclear weapons. We're talking about pretty basic stuff if this is where we are, as opposed to truly having a commitment that we can rely on internationally on how do we harness the benefits of AI for the benefit of including Global South, tying this to Gustavo's question, but also manage the risks and protect the rights in a way that would be advancing welfare across the nations and mitigate the various costs and risks that come in the absence of such governance. But I am encouraged that there at least is a conversation in G7, in G20, in the OECD, in the United Nations. China has its own China-led global AI initiative that they say is less hegemonic than the American ones and looks at more that interest in the global South. But I am not holding my breath in this being a particularly constraining or binding, which is not to say that it's meaningless.
Yeah, I have to say that it has been, it's not just these global treaties on AI that I am kind of a little bit cynical about. I feel the same way about the right and the left in the US coming together to agree on AI policies as well. There is a lot of movement about best practices, and the industry is so nascent that there is no agreement, even between companies or even as a technological layer in the industry, what these words mean and how they're being deployed within these companies. And so the idea of best practices is just it's a fiction right now. And of course everyone can agree on best practices, but that's it's a very vehicles in the park type of thing that it's if left undefined can be just can be a meaningless catch-all. So I'm going to ask the audience, we are going to have 15 minutes at the end to take audience questions. And so please raise your hands in the chat, and then also preface what your question is going to be about. If we have many questions, I'll just pick a few. But right now we're going to do another round of questions from our graduate students.
Yes, I wish we had more time to dive into all of these topics, but yes, Professor Bradford, you already talked about AI. So clearly we are now experiencing a sort of momentum for discussions on governance and AI between, let's say, polarized position on existential risk, but actual arms that are happening today. But you've talked extensively about this in your book presentation and your different discussions. But what we would like to ask, besides this buzz topic, we could call it right now, what are other tech sectors that you think, especially in this conflict or free model system that you've been theorized and discussing about, what are other tech sectors that you think will become even more relevant in the future? So you've talked about digital infrastructure, but we're interested specifically also in semiconductors, in Web 3.0, and also platform governance at large. So yes, that's a question.
Yeah. So very good, Julia. I think what is so fascinating about the tech sector that there are so many different dimensions, and I don't think many of the issues that we're tackling now are going to go anywhere anytime soon. So the massive concentration of the tech economy, which may well be amplified by AI, is going to keep competition law at the heart and center of many of these questions. We are very far from really protecting privacy. Again, something that I think can be amplified when AI presents more opportunities for surveillance. We can also, something that Kate knows really well, platform governance. We already struggling to contain disinformation. But when you have AI as an amplifier for disinformation, our sense of reality gets even more distorted, and we have even more powerful tools to make it harder for us to sort of tell the fact from fiction. And I'm particularly worried about next year with over 50 elections around the world, including US presidential elections and elections in the UK, European Parliament, in India, Indonesia, Mexico. So it's really massively important on what happens with platform governance and potential political interference in electoral integrity. So those are going to remain very important. I think we can't help but sort of just see again AI amplifying the chip wars and the question of semiconductors, because you need computing power to build and run these models. So that is going to be at the heart of center of the tech war, less again as a global governance, but to seeing how can we somehow manage and coordinate sanctions or build native capabilities there. I would say that of course AI remains at the heart and center, but there are other domains like quantum computing that is going to receive more and more attention, and that's going to be also heart of this kind of the next frontiers of technological development and the tech competition among the nations. So I think tech economy remains a multifaceted challenge where there's not going to be kind of one way for you to really govern this, but you do need to think about how these different tech policy domains interact and how they can be governed in a way that would be mutually reinforcing towards the goals that the governments have.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So my question refers to the Brussels effect. So this is a follow-up to your first book, The Brussels Effect, which I believe most people are familiar with it by now. And this global competition in the digital sphere is also a good context to take stock of what the Brussels effect has been, both
I think you just froze, Gustavo.
and to the EU institutions. So, no, I think we lost. I was out for a little bit. So my question is the Brussels effect enough as an asset for the European Union to protect and promote its model internationally? And also on if there are any alternative approach channels for the EU to promote its values, but also on a more personal note, how was it for your experience to see EU institutions embracing the Brussels effect and implementing even in the design of technology legislation?
Very good, thank you. So whether the Brussels effect is enough, I've always said that it's not enough, for instance, for the Europeans to think that our role in the global tech economy ought to be just to regulate it. So I think the Europeans should take comfort that they can influence and shape the global digital economy and the environment within which tech competition take place, and can move the tech development towards European rules. But also, it's hard for Europeans to really gain the leverage they need in today's non-cooperative environmental in tech environment unless they build true technological capabilities. So they shouldn't just be a referee, they should get on the game and play the game, offense and defense, and play it well. So that means Europe needs more technological capabilities. Now there is the Thierry Breton, the French industrial policy answer. Let's subsidize our way to technological competitiveness. Let's rely on industrial policy. Let's build European champions. I am worried about that route. I like regulation. I'm not a huge fan of protectionism. And I think with this trying to pick national champions, trying to subsidize our way into competitiveness, it's a very expensive route. And it's uncertain whether it will yield the benefits that it is intended. And I am not being naive. I think there are legitimate concerns that France and Germany and others have raised on European vulnerabilities and dependence. And I think we do need to realize that the geopolitical reality is going to remain challenging. We do need to acknowledge that many countries, including the US, are fueling this subsidy race. But I am more for thinking about technological sovereignty in terms of building genuine European capabilities, which means we would need to complement our commitment to rights-driven regulation with building the other pillars of European tech economy, meaning let's integrate the digital single market. That's the crown jewel of Europe. That's where the European power stems from. European tech companies cannot grow in Europe, they cannot scale unless they can really draw on an integrated market. We need more integration there. We need deep integrated capital markets union, where the European tech companies can raise money from a much bigger pool than they do if they're limited to their own national economy. We need to reroute our bankruptcy law so that risk-taking is possible and that allows for innovators to really pursue disruptive innovations. And we need a proactive immigration policy so that we can attract global talent to Europe as well. So those, to me, should be alongside the regulatory agenda that will strengthen Europe's position in the global digital economy. And to your second, sorry.
Are you writing about those ideas too? Also, don't you have a forthcoming article that you're writing kind of about like the...
Exactly, yes, Kate. So that's one law review article that I'm working on to really look at sort of trying to debunk this myth that digital regulation is the reason Europeans don't innovate. I don't think we need to give up on protection of fundamental rights. I think AI needs to be regulated, but it shouldn't sap all the energy and political capital, we also need to take care of those foundations of European competitiveness. Otherwise, I think we don't have a long-term future in the tech economy. Yes, so there's going to be a law review article that I am finalizing on that, and hopefully we'll get that out then next year. So Gustav, also your other question, what does it feel like when the European institutions talk about the Brussels effect? It's really interesting that I've seen that now enter the conversation much more. And some people, when I was talking about the book, when I published the book and book was getting a lot of traction, is that Anu, you ruined it by naming it. Like, it was working really well when we were able to keep it under the radar, and the Europeans got away with this whole thing. And now then when they're wearing it on their sleeve and say, well, let's regulate and let's rely on the Brussels effect, people are much more resentful and much more watchful of what the European regulation, what impact they have. The other danger is that the Europeans can become complacent, that I gave them I named them, that they have a superpower. And now you can sit back and say, yes, we regulate, we are having a role in the world. And they may forget these other things where they are not the superpower, that they still need to work on. So I intended to instill confidence, not complacency. And now I'm working on then sort of warning against overplaying their hand and turning to protectionism. And I'm also warning them that they shouldn't just be content with being a regulator, but the Brussels effect gives them the wonderful platform to believe that we can shape the environment within which we now need to build these other capabilities.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially as we see the European Union kind of regulate other aspects of digital, right? I guess before we look into the audience questions, maybe one last one. There's clearly, again, so much work that has gone into this book, but perhaps people tend to ask only about certain findings and maybe forget about others. So we were just kind of wondering if there's something important that maybe people aren't asking about enough, or is there anywhere where you think the conversation should now be going? And I feel like this kind of matches what you just said, but just in case, yeah, there's anything else there.
Oh, Anu,
Sorry,
So sorry, I'm trying to manage the noise here, which is I'm going back and forth with my muting. Thank you. So I think the one takeaway that there can be several takeaways. I guess that's the goal of the book. But the one takeaway that I would want everybody to spend some time thinking about is really this most important battle of all, which is what happens to liberal democracy. And to me, that's the one that really is most fundamental for us to get right. And I remind the people that liberal democracy can deteriorate one of two ways. One is if the US and the EU lose their horizontal battle to China. And we see the growth of digital authoritarianism as the sort of the guiding ideology for our digital economies. But also we see the deterioration of liberal democracy if the US and the EU lose the vertical battle to tech companies. And we are forced to concede that digital economies are either governed by authoritarians, whereas the democratic governments are prone to fail in that endeavor, or then it's governed by tech companies, because the Americans cannot legislate and the Europeans can legislate, but they struggle to enforce. China doesn't struggle to legislate. China doesn't struggle to enforce. But we need to now show that liberal democracy is a way that can work also when it comes to governing technology, that there is a liberal democratic way to govern technology, and we show that it works. And I think that requires the commitment by the governments to really embrace the authority that they have, use it well, use it wisely. And I think also for tech companies to sort of pick their battles, that ultimately, I don't think tech companies thrive in the world where digital economy has truly weakened and undermined our democratic institutions, whereby these companies become the tools that are used to undermine our elections in a way that I think really fundamentally undermines what it means to be a human in a democratic society. And ultimately, I think that's the takeaway, Laura, that I think to me was the most important one, that we need to focus on the horizontal battle, we need to focus on the vertical battle, and ultimately it is for us to show that liberal democracy is the model that can still be used to govern.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that I so love the fact that you highlight over and over again the vertical and horizontal frameworks, because I do feel as if the conversation, particularly like just consistently, people are routed in one or the other and fail to see the interaction of both. And it's really you really, I mean, part of what makes this problem so difficult, so intractable, is that they're both such dynamic fields in either direction, and you can't just be looking at one and solving for one without kind of considering the risks that you're exposing yourself to the other. Yeah. So we're going to go to audience questions, and just for expediency, rather than have people come on and ask questions, I'm going to just read the questions in the Q&A. Our first one is from Lorenzo Ancona, and who writes, in a recent interview for Financial Times, your focus has been on the critical issues of building a European industrial hub of innovation. In particular, you highlighted the failure to complete the single digital market as the main weakness for the development of European champions. In your view, can this momentum of AI be the right opportunity to address this issue?
Yeah, so I think AI certainly should be used as the kind of the awakening call for the Europeans, that they realize that this is almost existential. We cannot be left behind in this race. We need to make sure that the European AI companies can innovate, which also means that we need to open the digital single market for them so that these companies can grow in Europe. So I don't think the challenge necessarily is different for AI than it is for other digital services, but maybe because the economic stakes and the risks are both so magnified in the case of AI, it hopefully would sort of elevate the salience of the need to build that digital single market so that we can also then exploit commercially the AI across the European market. So in that sense, I think it's not a different question, but it's probably a question of more political salience.
The next question comes from Nicola Bianchi, who is the Robert Schuman Foundation Head of Studies, and he's working on a policy paper about the weaponized interdependence, and he says that he believes that the U.S., a geopolitical monster, is destined to retain its dominant position on AI, and to offset the famous Brussels effect. And he cites to President Biden's landmark executive order, which established new standards for AI safety and security, which I would argue was not quite so landmark as maybe people think that it was, while safeguarding privacy and promoting innovation. And so what is your opinion? I think he means, what is your opinion on the landmark executive order by Biden on AI? And can the EU remain an uber regulator? I think this is a great question, and one we've kind of discussed, but kind of puts it right on the nose.
Yeah, very good. I think this is inspired partially by The Economist, that was writing up basically comparing the underground empire and the Brussels effect, and doubting that the EU can remain an uber regulator. And I think in many ways, the European regulatory power will endure. And if I compare the EU's AI Act, assuming we now get it through the trialogue, we get it into a law, I think it is much more monumental than the US executive order. I do recognize that the executive order encapsulates a tremendous shift in how Americans view the relationship between the rights and the market and the state. And it certainly is a very clear evidence, I would say, of a trend I predict in the book, which is that the US is moving towards the European rights to end model. It is abandoning its kind of hardcore techno-libertarian views. But the US is more limited in its ability to really effectuate this change. So this is not the same as Congress passing a law. Executive orders have more limited impact because they rely on, it's tasking over 25 different agencies to do various things. And the question is, will these agencies do it? How do they implement it? Sometimes those obligations are rather soft. They publish studies, or they draft voluntary guidance for these companies to act in certain ways. That is still very much consistent with the market-driven model. We encourage them to do something, but we don't hold them accountable truly with the force of law and sanctions if they don't. So in that sense, yes, it's maybe 102 pages. Yes, it has strong language. I am not going to negate that it is a shift. it's still more vulnerable also. We have presidential elections next year in the United States. If Trump comes into power, he can revoke that executive order. So it's still not the same as the European commitments that will be hard law and that will be binding. So I guess that would be my sort of quick takeaway of the executive order. But I think it's harder for the Americans now, the government, to really criticize the AI Act, because that's exactly what the executive order is trying to do with less of a binding force.
No, really well stated. And I would just add, and I think that you summed it up really well, but I would just add that, yes, that this is, by the time that the agencies figure out in the 4 years or 8 years that Biden would hold the presidency and this executive order would seemingly be in effect, it is unclear whether or not it would still be in effect. It is unclear how they would be challenged in courts. So they would undoubtedly be challenged in courts by all of these tech companies. And so they probably would be, there would be injunctions against their enforcement. And so there's just a number of really and huge, monumental, I would say, like enforcement hurdles that prevent this from being the kind of the sweeping change that the EU is capable of doing seemingly overnight with things like GDPR and the DSA and everything else. Next question comes from someone who's anonymous, but asks how your insights from the latest book could inform foreign policy making in smaller EU states, such as Finland or Slovakia, when it comes to digital economy. And I'd also add, I'm curious what your thoughts are about Estonia, which has like a very strong kind of stance on internet policy and internet freedom. When it comes to making a digital economy, the interests of smaller open economies often go against the interests of larger, more protectionist EU economies.
Yeah. So the smaller countries, in particular in the north, so here Estonia, other Baltic countries, Finland, the other Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands and Ireland. This is a bloc that used to work together with the UK to balance the Franco-German influence. That counterforce that was more pro-innovation, a little bit more for markets, less comfortable with industrial policy and the kind of dirigist state intervention, it's now less powerful with the UK not being part of the coalition. So France has now gained at the expense of the free trade bloc, and the Germans seem to be playing along with the French pretty well. So depends whether you like it or not, where your priors are, but I just descriptively, one needs to observe the shift, that we are moving towards a little bit more state-driven industrial policy leaning approach in tech regulation. And the small countries are less able to then resist that change. And it's particularly harmful for when we are starting to allow for subsidies that start distorting the common market. Bigger economies like France is in a stronger position to subsidize than a country like Estonia or Finland. So this is really tilting the balance towards the larger wealthy economies, as opposed to even if you have small wealthy economies, they just don't have the same ability to prevail in the subsidy race. So I think the Nordic countries are very concerned about this new direction, especially they export-driven economies that really need access to the single market and the broader world. So that's one issue. Generally, I would just mention, also use this as an opportunity to comment the intra-EU differences. Sometimes they compromise the EU's ability to really hold out its rights-driven model. So when Hungary is undermining rule of law and fundamental rights and democracy, it's harder for the EU to go and say, like, our model is really embodying these democratic values and rule of law and fundamental rights. But in other cases, I think there's also now the way that the differences across member states lead to a more balanced outcome. So Germans are like hardcore protectors of privacy. France is much more willing to recognize exceptions for law enforcement. Impartially, France has endured some horrible terror attacks and needs to recognize that law enforcement is also important. France is more of a geopolitical and military power. It has more surveillance capabilities. And I think, and this is, I think, what I'm willing to state now, that the events in Russia's invasion in Ukraine has kind of heightened to many countries that the optimal amount of surveillance is not zero. That you do need some surveillance in order to protect the national security. And including American surveillance has benefited Europeans tremendously in finding out what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. So sometimes we get to a more balanced place when the French views on surveillance are compromising a little bit more, moving the Germans towards somewhat less rigid absolutist privacy stand. But the France's exceptions to privacy, and I'm not saying France is anti-privacy at all, but I think there are more of an awareness of some trade-offs, are balanced when you have also then the German views of very strong sort of fundamental privacy perspective. So ultimately, the European regulations sometimes are better because they already reflect a compromise across different member states, which is why they work outside in different legal regimes, because they are already designed to work in somewhat different legal settings.
That was as a person who is specifically here to be kind of like getting to like learning the intricacies of these intra-European things. That was a wonderful summary. So thank you for that. Two more questions and then we're going to close. One from Margot Williams and one from Victoria Otter. Margot asks, Anu, do you have thoughts on the best path forward for building up tech infrastructure in countries which need foreign investment to do so? Thinking Belt and Road Initiative and things like it. Would love to know if you see a more optimistic path forward, or maybe people in democratic countries are overly pessimistic. And Victoria asks, we have talked a lot about the governance aspect of the digital paradigm. I would like to know what you think of the perspective of the citizens, which I always think is a great way to kind of keep in mind as we talk about all of these power, where the power is ostensibly coming from, how we can ensure citizens remain to have trust that technologies will be deployed in their benefit. Beyond regulation, how do we avoid asymmetrical communications to their interests and well-being? And you're muted.
Sorry, very good, thank you. So in terms of the Belt and Road and the digital Silk Road as a sub-segment of the Chinese infrastructure power, I think the Europeans and Americans have had a hard time countering that power for the few reasons that I mentioned, meaning it's the Chinese infrastructure often is more affordable and it's very good, and the developing countries don't have the luxury of turning it down for something that is less affordable for them. The Europeans are now a little belatedly realizing this. So there's been an attempt to really reinforce the global gateway as a European alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. There was a big summit around it, I think a week or two ago, where Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, and others were pledging much more funding and political support for this project. I think it's absolutely important, because Europeans cannot just have the words that we have an alternative to China. They actually need to, the question is whether they will, but they would need to support with actual financial power that is backing it. And it still relies a lot on private investment that we don't know whether it will fully materialize. So I think it's unclear whether the global gateway will be a genuine alternative. It's also very ambitious if it tries to be building physical infrastructures, digital infrastructures across so many parts of the world. It requires a lot of money at the time. Europeans need a lot of money for many other projects, including green transition, digital transition inside Europe, building European armies, building Ukrainian army, rebuilding Ukraine, shoring up the social welfare systems, responding to democratic crises. Nothing happens if there's no economic growth in the EU. And that's why I'm going back to these foundations of European competitiveness and leveraging technology for that. Let me end with the question on citizens. I really welcome that ending, because I think ultimately it brings all of us as having agency in this process, which I think is crucially important. So here I would want to say that the European model is designed to give the citizens more of a voice. It's designed to enhance the democratic governance, which would mean that the citizens are giving feedback through elections, but also by contributing to the process of legislation. In the US, that lobbying process is pretty much captured by the ones who have the money, so big companies. But research shows that in the EU, even though there's a lot of corporate lobbying, including lobbying by tech companies, that is often counterbalanced by access that civil society has to policymakers, to the members of the parliament, to the commission. And their views do get interwoven into the legislative process, which is why if you look at heavily lobbied legislations like the GDPR, the DSM, and DMA, they are not sort of neglecting the citizen view and only reflecting the views of the tech companies. In many ways, the tech companies' influence in those ended up being much more limited. But ultimately, I think I would really invite us as digital citizens to demand the tech companies for the kind of products and services that serve our interests, because ultimately they cannot run the tech economy without the users, and we need to be able to hold them accountable, asking them to govern the technologies, produce those products, build them in a way that ultimately is responsive to the kind of interest that we have. If we hold them to a high standard with respect to privacy, they have no choice but direct their tech development with the view of ensuring that that tech also preserves our privacy. So there, I think I would just want to emphasize that the citizens do play a role there.
Yeah, what a wonderful way to end, kind of on the note that this is that really truly leveraging both the vertical and the horizontal together as citizens, pushing for reform from the private companies while also pushing reform through democratic measures. The states is just like such an important, is really the best. Is really the only way that that citizens can continue to leverage their voices against kind of these powers that be. But Professor Bradford, thank you so much for joining us. Anu, it was wonderful to see you, and I hope that I get to see you again soon. Selfishly, because I was sad that we didn't get to do this all together in Paris. But thank you so much to Julia and Gustavo and Laura for organizing this wonderful panel, and for everyone joining us. There is a link to Professor Bradford's book, Digital Empires, in the chat. And with that, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Thursday.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Wonderful conversation. Excellent questions. Really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Bradford. And of course, thank you so much, Kate Klonik, for the moderation work. It was really amazing.
Of course. Great.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.